Hello, this is Robert Larson. I'm the owner of the Larson Law Office in Mesa, Arizona. And earlier this week, I posted a video where I talked about what happens to your home in a divorce in Arizona. So I talked about whether your house would be considered community property or separate property under Arizona law. And just a general review is that generally your property is going to be considered community property, meaning both spouses own it equally. But there are some exceptions where it could be considered separate property. And so watch that video if you want to know more about that part of it. But today I just wanted to talk a little more about how it gets divided in a practical matter in a divorce. So if it's separate property, so let's say the wife is considered to be the separate owner of the home, so it's her separate property and they're going through a divorce, that means the wife is going to receive the home. It's not necessarily being awarded to her because it's already hers. The court is just making a determination that it is her separate property, so it goes to her or continues to be owned by her, and the husband doesn't receive anything of value in exchange for it. So basically, it's the wife's property, and let's say it's worth $100,000, or has $100,000 equity. The husband doesn't get half of that in exchange for the wife receiving it. So basically, it just belongs to the wife, and the community property goes into a different category where it gets divided equally. So anyway, the husband doesn't get anything in exchange for wife owning the home because she already owned it in the first place. So the community property, generally there's one of two things that are going to happen. One is you're either going to sell the property, or two, one spouse is going to buy out the other spouse of their share of the equity. So number one is the most common, just because as a practical matter, a lot of times there's a lot of equity and it might be difficult to pay out the other spouse and remove their name from it. And so, and also a lot of times people just want to move on and it's just cleaner and easier to sell the house. So in that situation, basically you have to agree on who's going to sell it. You have to find a realtor and list the property and sell it, and then whatever money's left over after that process is done, you split it equally. So it's a fairly simple process, and so that's one of the reasons why that's the most common and most popular way to deal with the house once a community property house anyway, once the divorce is finalized. And actually you can do it while you're going through the divorce as long as both spouses are cooperative about it. And if you can do that, it can be actually a benefit, because by the time your divorce is done, maybe you already have the money coming in, or coming in soon at least, and that way it helps you move on and find another place to live once the divorce is finished. So you don't necessarily have to wait until the divorce is over to start that process. So I've represented many people who've been able to sell their home and already get the money before the divorce is done, and that can be extremely helpful. Another thing to remember is you want to be able to agree on who the realtor is going to be, and if not, then the courts have a way of deciding those things, but it's much easier if you can just agree on those things. Another thing that can come up when you're selling the house is, are you just going to sell it and each keep the money that's left over? Or some divorce decrees will say that certain debts are going to be paid before anyone receives any money from the home. So this can come in really handy in a situation where you don't believe your soon-to-be ex-spouse will use the money from the home to pay certain debts that need to be paid. And in a divorce decree, it will say who's responsible to pay certain debts. So you might be responsible to pay a certain credit card, and your ex-spouse is responsible to pay another credit card, and things like that. But if they don't pay that, the creditor can go after either one of you. So if you have concerns about that, then sometimes it could be helpful to put into your divorce decree that all debts will be paid, or at least specific debts will be paid out of the proceeds from the sale of the home before any party receives any money. And that way you can make sure that the debts are paid, and by the time you get the money, whatever's left from the house, you know those debts aren't going to come back and haunt you, and it can be a good solution too. So that's another thing to keep in mind. The other option is one spouse wants to keep the home, so they buy the other spouse out of their share of the equity. So if you have $100,000 equity, that means one spouse needs to pay the other one $50,000. Plus they need to get their name off of it. So it's not just coming up with the money, you've got to get their name off of it, because if their name is still on the loan, on the mortgage, then they're not going to be able to get another mortgage for until that happens under most circumstances. So usually if the spouse who's not going to be keeping the house, they want to make sure their name's not on the home anymore so that they're not liable for it. So generally that's going to be refinancing. And if not, then you just have to be able to come up with the money and get their name off of it some other way. But generally you're going to refinance the mortgage and pay the other spouse their share of the equity. Many people have made the argument that, hey, if we sold the house, we'd have to pay realtor fees and this fee and that fee, etc., and we wouldn't actually get $100,000. We'd only get like 70 or 80,000. So really, I should only have to pay my ex-spouse like 35 or maybe 40,000 at most, or something like that. And that argument has been made many times in many different ways, and it almost always fails. I've never seen it succeed. Basically, if you want to keep the home, you pay the other spouse their 50% share, and judges are pretty consistent with that, in Arizona at least. The argument makes logical sense, but judges aren't buying it. So typically you're going to either agree on the home's value, or you're going to have to pay for an appraisal, and that way you can determine the equity. And then usually another thing to remember is you want to have deadlines under any of these options. You always want to put deadlines in your divorce decree. So for example, if you're going to refinance, you want to give the spouse who's trying to refinance, whether it's 2 months or 3 months or 6 months or a year. I mean, usually it's more 2 or 3 months, but you want to have a deadline where if they can't refinance it by a certain time, then it has to be listed for sale, and you go with the other option where you're just selling it. Because otherwise, if you don't have those deadlines in there, then basically you have a court order that says something has to be done, but it doesn't tell us when it has to happen. And I've been involved with a handful of cases over the years where people have come back after 5, 10, 15 years, and they're still on the mortgage of their ex-spouse's home, and they can't get another home themselves, and they want to move on, and it can be kind of difficult sometimes. So anyway, you always want to make sure there's deadlines, and even when you're selling the property, you want to make sure there's deadlines, and you want to make sure that you have orders in place that tell you what's going to happen while you're trying to sell the home. Like, for example, who's going to be paying the mortgage and other expenses while you're going through the process. So anyway, you want to make sure all those details are taken care of. But as a practical matter, it can get kind of tricky and a little difficult sometimes. You want to make sure you have all those details in your final divorce decree. But overall, it's fairly simple. It's just there's a lot of details to be considered as well. So hopefully that's helpful. And if you're ever in a situation and you need some help, feel free to give me a call. If you found this video helpful, definitely like it. Feel free to comment and follow this page, and you can get more content like this.